to this, the closing ceremony of the second UN Pacific Regional Forum on Business and Human Rights. I will now hand over the moderating task to Professor Surya Dev, Chair of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, who will introduce a wonderful array of final speakers. Surya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, from wherever you are joining. It's my great pleasure to moderate this closing session of the second UN Forum on Business and Human Rights for the Pacific. It has been really wonderful to talk about a range of issues during these 2 days. And I think one exciting part of this forum has been the national hubs that we created in 4 Pacific countries, in Fiji, in PNG, in Vanuatu, and the Marshall Islands. So I think that has been a very exciting, innovative aspect of this forum. So now, today in this last session, basically the goal is to connect the dots and also try to articulate the building blocks where we should be going on business and human rights in the Pacific in the coming years. Who should be doing what? And it gives me a great pleasure to moderate this, a very distinguished panel of representatives from the government, UN agencies, business, civil society groups, and also other organizations. So this is really wonderful. So let me quickly introduce all the panelists in one go, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists a question, and then hopefully there'll be time for a second round of questions as well as, and if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So let me start with the brief introductions. So we have a video message from Ambassador Nazhat Khan, who is the president of the UN Human Rights Council. Then we have the High Commissioner, Jonathan Curr, who is the New Zealand High Commissioner to Fiji. We also have Mr. Paul Wilson, who is the Deputy High Commissioner of Australia to Fiji with us. Then we have Mr. Livio Sarandrea, who is the Chief Advisor and Manager of Business and Human Rights, leading the work in Asia Pacific for UNDP. We have Vanessa Zimmerman. She is the Chief Executive Officer of Pillar 2, as well as the Director and Chair of Human Rights at the Global Compact Network Australia. Then we have Lucille Paru. She is the Executive Director of Papua Native Landowners Association, Inc. And last but not least, we have Ms. Sagufta Salma Janij, who is the Executive Director of Fusion Hub, representing the youth voice, but also a social enterprise. So, as Vanessa has to leave a little early, so if others don't mind, I would like to start with her, Vanessa. And my question to you is that you have worked very closely with late Professor John Ruggie, who unfortunately passed away a couple of months back. And you worked very closely with him in developing the UN guiding principles. You have also advised multinationals in Australia as well as in other parts of the world. So where do you see the progress in terms of the implementation of UN guiding principles from the private sector's perspective? And in your assessment, whether companies in this region have done enough to implement the UN guiding principles? So if you can share your thoughts with us, that would be excellent. You have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Professor Deva, and thank you very much to the organizers for having me here today. I would much rather be with you in Fiji than here in Melbourne and in other places of the Pacific, but it's really good to be with you today, and thank you for the question. I'm sure that you've already discussed this over the course of the last few days, but I wanted to pay tribute to Professor Ruggie as well. A very special contribution that he made to this space in giving us the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, but also in other parts of his leadership. So I wanted to just quickly pay that tribute. So Surya has given me a tricky question, but a very good one, which is what progress has been made and what else could be done. And I think in terms of the progress, there are 3 things that I wanted to talk about today. The first is that we are seeing more companies, mainly larger ones, so we need to work on that, and we need to make sure that smaller and medium-sized enterprises are doing this too. But we are seeing a larger group of companies that are starting to acknowledge that they do have a responsibility to respect human rights, that they should be doing things to make sure that they're not harming human rights. And they're putting in place a variety of innovative tools and practical tools to do that, so that for these companies, it's becoming much less about the why and about how they should be actually working to respect human rights. So we see these companies coming out with human rights policies that are explaining what they will do, how they're committing to respect human rights, and what they will do to make that happen. We see the boards of some companies now having human rights within their mandate. So it being very clear that some of these boards of very, very large corporations have to look at human rights as part of the other risks that they're looking at for the company. We see companies doing human rights training for their people, and sometimes also for their suppliers and for their other business partners. And some of these companies, like Nestle, are making that human rights training public so that anybody can see it, and so that companies from other sectors or that might be smaller and not have the same resources like a big company such as Nestle have access to that type of training. We're seeing companies doing human rights impact assessments, and I am aware of a couple going on in the Pacific region where companies, whether before a particular project or because of their faced certain allegations and they want to better understand their impacts, are looking at human rights impact assessments. Now, none of these things, Professor Ruggie used to like to use the term that there's no silver bullet solution to issues in the business and human rights space. So none of what I'm telling you is going to solve everything tomorrow, but the very fact that these companies are doing more along these lines is a good thing. But again, we need to see some not just huge companies, not just transnational companies, but also companies that are based perhaps just in one country, or smaller companies also taking these steps. The second element of progress is that the law is catching up. And we see, first of all, in Australia, the Modern Slavery Act, which has been a very important law in terms of building companies' awareness of their modern slavery risks across their operations and their supply chains here in Australia, but also overseas. We see New Zealand talking about this type of law. We have seen various countries in Europe looking to something called mandatory human rights due diligence, which I expect you've spoken about over the last few days, and which is about basically requiring companies to be able to know and show that they respect human rights. So we're seeing these types of developments, and I've worked a lot with business. I've worked inside a very large business, and now I work with businesses from different sectors every day. And you might ask, would companies think that this is a good thing, that the law is catching up? But in fact, many of the companies that I work with actually do think that it's a good thing, that the law is catching up, because it means that there could be more consistency across jurisdictions. It means that it sounds a bit cliched, but it means that the playing field can be leveled, so that if you are a company that's been working very hard on this, and you would like to see other companies also doing the same thing, so that you are not perhaps disadvantaged in anything that you're doing, it helps with that. It helps to get more support from government. So alongside the Australian Modern Slavery Act, we saw very positive work from the department that was in charge of helping to implement that act, in giving support to business through guidance tools, through various engagement that they were doing. And it also can be very important for people inside a company, whether it's a big or small company, because sometimes it gives you the stick that you need to be able to say to people internally, we have to do something. It's not a nice to do. We have to actually do these things. And the third one, just very quickly, that I guess progress that has been made over the last 10 years is that we're seeing a lot more interconnections between different parts of the sustainability forum. So in terms of environmental, social and governance issues, ESG as we call them, we're seeing a lot more connections now to human rights. So climate change and human rights. At the recent discussions in Glasgow, there's a lot of discussion about just transition, as I'm sure you've talked about, and the need to make sure that as we work towards various climate initiatives, that we don't leave humans behind as well, and that we make sure that we're paying attention to rights. Anti-corruption and human rights, looking at the connections between those issues and knowing that often if there is corruption, there will likely be human rights issues and vice versa. So this is a good thing in terms of breaking down silos between different stakeholders and different businesses and parts of businesses, giving people a greater understanding of why all of these things are important, because often the same reasons apply to each of these different elements, and often leading to longer lasting solutions. Because if we only look at one part of a problem and we don't look at the whole part, then we could be in difficulty. So then just quickly, because I don't want to go over my time, should I be quiet?
Yeah, if you can wrap it up very quickly.
Let me wrap it up.
I'm giving you a little bit more time because you won't be here for the entire duration. Otherwise, I would really hope that the remarks can be brief. Thank you.
No, that's okay. I will promise to finish up on this. So you asked me if companies are doing enough. Despite everything I just said, no, I think they could do a lot more. I think that they need to look at the basics of the UN Guiding Principles. So just understanding what adverse human rights impacts they could be part of, who they could be involved in them with, what types of business partners such as suppliers, and really look at grievance mechanisms to really look at how they're allowing people to complain. But my last 3 points, I promise, were just really that I think we need to see all stakeholders trying new things. But when they try those new things, they have to make sure they've got enough resources and tools to do that. We need to see more active listening across different stakeholder groups. And I think we do need to see business playing a greater role in advocacy, whether it's around just transition and climate change or modern slavery or some other issues. So I'll stop there. And as Surya said, unfortunately, I have to leave soon. But thank you for having me, and I'll listen for the next couple of minutes and value being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And you talked about what the companies have been doing and what they should do more in the coming decade. Now, let me now turn my attention to the governments, what the governments have been doing and should do more. And probably I would like to start with you, Livio, first. And if you can share, based on your UNDP work with the governments in South and East Asia, what lessons can we draw for the Pacific? And in particular, as I understand, UNDP is now going global in terms of their BHR work. So what plans do you have for the Pacific? So if you can be brief, that will be very much appreciated.
I will.
Thank you.
I will try. Thank you, Surya. Thank you, Professor Deva, and greetings from Bangkok. Indeed, the business and human rights journey so far in Asia, which I had the privilege to be part of with you and a few others also in this panel, gave us the opportunity to learn many lessons. And some of these lessons are very context specific, not transferable, but some are indeed more universal. And so we should be using them. We are using them as UNDP as we are scaling up our work in other regions of the world. So you asked for lessons. Let me try to give you 4 lessons that we have learned in 4 minutes, right? And so that is the time allocated to me. Now, the first lesson will have to be about knowledge being the first stepping stone. We can't jump into action and from action to impact if we don't start first with knowledge. It is fundamental to invest first and foremost on raising awareness. I saw with my own eyes the commitment came in Asia only after we reached a certain level of awareness. In Thailand, for example, in Indonesia, or in Vietnam, where most recently we've seen a lot of progress after a lot of investment in awareness raising. And so we are seeing that, again, progress is somehow strictly proportional to the level of awareness reached among all relevant stakeholders. The second lesson is also about knowledge, and it is about the fact that raising awareness is a never-ending process. Just when you think that you have a good group of people who are familiar with that ABC of business and human rights, and you are ready to move down the alphabet, so to speak, new actors will come into play because the discourse is growing, or you are deepening your awareness campaign, or simply there is a change of actors, right? So those working on business and human rights, states and actors like us, need to have the patience to restart with the ABC again. One needs patience and passion to be able to deliver those same messages almost as a mantra over and over. You know how much I admire the way you, Surya, talk about the 3 pillars of the UNGPs for the 150th time in conferences, and still manage to make it sound fresh as it was the first time you are talking about it. Of course, there's a need to keep focusing on ABC, but in parallel, we're sharing more detailed knowledge to those who progress in their knowledge trajectory and are hungry for more, especially in an area like business and human rights, which is evolving very rapidly. Third lesson is about will and commitment. To make the difference, awareness and knowledge need to be turned into acknowledgement and will to change. And while knowledge is often a bottom-up process, commitment needs to be top-down, or at least it is more critical, we have seen, when it is expressed from the top. Again, the experience of Asia tells me that the level of progress has been proportional to the level of engagement of the leadership of a country, as well as leadership of in companies, in other words, CEOs. Fourth lesson, my last one, is that to make the difference, awareness and even will or commitment are not enough. You need capacity. Vanessa was just making reference to it. You need a critical mass of actors that are invested in the agenda. You won't go a long way to adopt an app with just one ministry in charge. You need 4, 5 ministries, perhaps more involved. Or a National Human Rights Commission won't be able to provide effective remedies with only one investigator working on business and human rights. Capacity and resources are needed to really move the needle. Thailand was the country to first adopt an app in Asia. I'm sure this was discussed, but was also the country that I know in Asia that budgeted specifically for business and human rights. This applies, of course, to somehow to all of us, right? Also to development actors. It may sound like a cliche thing to say, but B+HR Asia, the program I'm in charge of, would have not been able to do what it did without the resources made available by our donors, which include the government of Sweden, whom I know supports this forum as well. This forum also won't happen without resources. And with this, I come to the second part of your question. Does UNDP have plans to work in the Pacific? The short answer is yes, and I'm very happy to say so. You know that for many reasons, we have been prioritizing Asia and other regions, also because OHCHR is doing a great job here in the Pacific. But I can now confirm that we are starting to think about the next phase of our project. And at this stage, we are planning indeed on adding a few countries in focus from the Pacific. We'll have to have conversation with our donors, of course, before confirming that, but it is very much our wish to be programming in this region from 2022 or 2023. I'll stop here, Surya, and thank you. Of course, very happy to expand on any points depending on requests.
Excellent, Livio. And I think it is pleasing to know that the UNDP is going to move its footprint to this part of the world as well. So this is really encouraging to hear that, because we need that kind of capacity and resources to move the agenda forward. Now, I'm privileged to have 2 representatives of the government who the working group believes have a leadership role to play. These are Australia and New Zealand. So Jonathan, if I may start with you, you have worked, of course, in Tonga and currently based in Fiji. So you know the challenges in the Pacific region very well in terms of the business and human rights issues. So what leadership role you think the government of New Zealand can play, especially because in their most recent UPR, the government committed to draft and develop a Nation Action Plan on business and human rights. So if you can share any thoughts about the leadership role that you see, not only within New Zealand, but in the region, I think that will be very much appreciated. You have the floor, Jonathan, now.
Surya, and tēnā koutou katoa. A very good afternoon to all of you joining us for this panel discussion. Let me begin with just some brief contextual remarks, about New Zealand and how we see ourselves in the region. I mean, as a Pacific nation, Aotearoa New Zealand is deeply connected with the region by people, culture, history, politics, and shared aspirations. And in our work in the Pacific, we're guided by the Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles of partnership, protection, and participation in our pursuit of bettering human rights. As many of the participants this afternoon will be aware, the Pacific's a region with which New Zealand trades extensively, where there are rich and varied business connections in all directions, a region that supplies many of New Zealand's migrant workers through seasonal labour schemes, for example, and a region in which the exploitation of workers sadly does happen. Many businesses already ensure that they look after their workers, their customers, and the communities in which they operate in by complying with regulations and with relevant laws. This is a great start, but it needs to go a lot further. Businesses also need to consider the rights of people in every country that their business has an impact on. And unfortunately, visibility of human rights impacts of business in the Pacific has been low in my experience. Human rights have all too often been seen as more of a government problem than a business issue that needs to be grappled with. When I was posted in Tonga almost 20 years ago, I was in preparing for this discussion this afternoon. I don't recall anybody speaking about business and human rights, whether in New Zealand, Tonga, or to the best of my knowledge, anywhere else in the Pacific at the time. But 20 years later, that landscape has changed dramatically. I remember within weeks of arrival in Fiji, I was visited by a group from the diplomacy training program, which is involved in this conference. And I was asked a business almost straight up by one of the participants on human rights in business. So that has changed a lot in the 20 years that I've been in and out of the region. But with new foreign investment growing in parts of the Pacific, increasing globalization of business and the movement of people, it's clear that Pacific communities face increasing challenges for fair and informed engagement, especially with large-scale companies. The global challenges of COVID-19 and climate change have also, I think, exacerbated existing human rights concerns. And in the Pacific, the impacts of COVID-19 have been complex and far-reaching. The closure of international borders amplified existing economic constraints, and many Pacific Island countries are facing significant economic impacts and severe fiscal pressures. And Fiji, where I am at the moment, is one of those countries grappling with these issues. So New Zealand is working to ensure that the response and recovery to the pandemic in the Pacific respects and promotes the human rights and needs of everyone. And in an environment where there may be the temptation to diminish the importance of human rights relative to other priorities, we also have to ensure that these remain at the forefront of our thinking. So New Zealand's working hard to support businesses to take steps to address and prevent human rights impacts associated with business activity. New Zealand businesses and many of the businesses with which I engage in Fiji are increasingly aware that respecting human rights is not only the right thing to do, it's good for their business. Last year, as you indicated, Surya, the New Zealand government announced a series of sweeping changes to prevent the exploitation of temporary migrant workers, improve enforcement of the law, and to appropriately resource this important work. And leading by example is something that New Zealand strives to do in the region and as a good international citizen in the multilateral system. And as you're aware, the Pacific, I think, is the only region without any countries that have developed a national action plan on business and human rights. We accepted the recommendation in our last Universal Periodic Review to develop our own national action plan. And the importance of establishing comprehensive and systematic national action plans to prevent adverse human rights impacts by businesses, I think, cannot be overstated. One of the challenges, but also opportunities for the Pacific, is raising awareness of the human rights responsibilities of companies operating in the region and to encourage the development of national action plans. And I was interested to see Livio pick up on the importance of awareness raising in the region too. So there's a need to further educate businesses, government actors, and individuals on the international rules requiring respect for human rights in business. And states such as New Zealand need to be discussing the importance of this with our partners in the Pacific region, with our own businesses, and to explore the provision of technical assistance where it might be required to develop national action plans and related legislative and regulatory frameworks as well. And I'm pleased that conferences such as this help bring to light the nature and scale of the issues that we need to confront in our region in order to protect and promote human rights and human flourishing throughout the region. Fundamental to achieving success in addressing these issues is also effective partnership. And from an enforcement perspective, human rights violations in business often occur in conjunction with other exploitative and illegal practices. Given our interdependencies within the region, the extensive network of our business relationships and interjurisdictional cooperation, it's imperative that we work together to identify and to respond to these practices whenever they occur. New Zealand, therefore, looks forward to continuing to work in partnership with Pacific governments, with Indigenous organisations and multilateral forums, recognising too that in New Zealand, we also have much work to do in the realisation of fundamental human rights. And I'll conclude there. Thank you very much, Surya, for the opportunity to participate in this afternoon.
Excellent, Jonathan. And I hear a lot of P's: partnerships and planning. You're talking about a plan, national action plan. You're talking about perhaps prevention of human rights abuses, the adverse impact, right? So I think those are really crucial P's, and I very much hope that New Zealand can work with other governments and other actors, and could be the first government in the region to have a national action plan in the near future. So thank you very much for that. Now I would like to bring in another country who we would like, as a working group, we would like to take the leadership role. So Paul, if I could bring you in now. So Australia, as Vanessa also mentioned, was the first country in the region that adopted a modern slavery legislation, which was quite landmark development in this part of the world, because this has an impact even outside Australia. Now, as this law is up for review, and we see the emergence of mandatory human rights due diligence laws coming out of Europe, as we just heard, New Zealand is moving ahead with its SNAP. We see several other countries in Asia developing an app or about to develop an app. So where do you see Australia going forward in terms of the leadership, not only within Australia, but in the region in terms of pushing the business and human rights agenda? So Paul, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And look, may I start first of all by sort of saying on behalf of the Australian government and all of the Australian officials who've been on Zoom over the last 2 days that we've been very grateful to join this second Pacific Forum on business and human rights. And I want to thank the OHCHR regional office for the Pacific and the working group on business and human rights and all the partners for convening this forum. Australia has a particularly strong interest in the interaction between business and human rights. So, as I said, we're very pleased to have joined this forum. It's a very simple question that you've asked, but it's also a very broad one that you've asked, and noting that you've sort of grounded it in the Modern Slavery Act of 2018, which Vanessa Zimmerman also made reference to. So, in terms of Australian leadership, I mean, we think that this law in itself provides a level of example within the international community, not only because of the norms that it sets for Australian business and in legislation, but also very clearly the transparency element of the law and the reporting requirements under those laws. There's a requirement under these laws that companies and other entities based in Australia which have consolidated revenue of more than 100 million Australian dollars need to report annually on their actions to identify and address modern slavery risks in their global operations and supply chains. And obviously that has a number of benefits. One is that it further establishes those norms, but it also establishes if you like, a dialogue between companies and consuming publics, the consumers of goods and services, which in itself can has the potential to create competitive edges for those who are as transparent as possible. And you've mentioned, the reach of these laws, and I think you're right in saying that, in the sense that they provide, or this law, we like to see as exemplary for other countries, but it also establishes the baseline for behaviour and for transparencies for Australian companies who are dealing with companies overseas. And Australia is an internationalised and open economy, and the linkages that we see between Australian companies and overseas companies, and hopefully the flow through of habits and norms that sit within companies that work together, is part of that broader framework we hope to see of Australia supporting I guess an extension. I was thinking of the French word rayonnement, the broadening out of habits and norms by business. I think obviously Australia will continue to advocate for these approaches in multilateral fora. We've at the multilateral level, Australia has supported the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights since their inception in 2011, and we encourage businesses to apply those guiding principles in their operations in Australia and abroad. And the value that we see of these guiding principles for both states and businesses, that clearly they provide a common basis for national, regional, and international efforts. I guess I've spoken, and the commentary has been around over the last this response and the last response around government's role. Jonathan spoke for New Zealand. I'm speaking from Australia, but I also see a leadership role, and we're seeing this leadership role not only with individual businesses but also with peak bodies. I'm here speaking on behalf of the Australian government, but I also happen to be a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and that's an organisation which has done a lot of work, and there are reasons why it's done that. This work. It's a membership body. It wants to see its members comply with Australian legislation, but it has taken up on a range of issues, including on climate change, including on the SDGs more broadly, but on issues of modern slavery. A very strong advocacy role within its business membership, and I also see a role there for these kinds of peak bodies also to be reaching out to fellow organisations in other countries. And I guess this sort of loops back more generally to the concept of business and human rights. The subject of this forum is about business and human rights. I represent the government, and obviously government has a role, but obviously business ultimately has a role, and not just as the followers of laws or the implementers as required by legislation, but also being the strong advocates through the daily practice of trading through their general commerce with other countries, with other companies in other countries, but also in those peak bodies. So all of them working together with the multilateral organisations as well, working as partners. That's a rather discursive answer, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you for the opportunity. And may I just say again, look, I know that this has been a very useful forum, which has covered a range of topics over the last couple of days. And it really has been a very important opportunity to reflect on shared priorities and reflect and progress shared priorities, those shared between business and government and regional and multilateral organisations. So I commend the organisers again, and I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to offer perspectives at the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Probably I will come back to you, because one thing I want to hear from the Australian government is that move beyond modern slavery. And I would really hope that the Australian government starts moving towards a more comprehensive view of the business and human rights agenda and develop a national action plan as New Zealand has committed and is starting to take those baby steps. So probably I'll come back to you on that if the Australian government could move in this particular direction as well. But may now I invite all of us to listen to the video message which Ambassador Khan, who is currently the president of the Human Rights Council, because of the time difference, she could not join us live, but she recorded an important message, I guess, for all of us. So I would request the IT team to play that video message at this stage. And then I will come back to the two other panelists. And hopefully this time I will have some final round of reflections as well. Okay.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Bula Vinaka. It is my great honor to speak to you all today at the closing plenary of this second United Nations Pacific Forum on Business and Human Rights. Allow me to thank the organizers of this forum, the Pacific Regional Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, in collaboration with the International Labour Organization, the United Nations Capital Development Fund, UN Women, UN Environmental Programme, the University of Queensland, the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Asia Pacific Forum, the Citizens Constitutional Forum, and the Diplomacy Training Programme, with the support of the Government of Sweden. It is without a doubt that the momentum to better address business and human rights issues in the Pacific continues to build, raising awareness and building the capacity of various stakeholders to fully and effectively implement the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This momentum speaks to the commitment of the Pacific. The Pacific, like all other regions, has felt the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. And like the rest of the world, the Pacific continues to remain resilient. When looking ahead, as we build back better after the pandemic and prepare for future health emergencies, it would be a missed opportunity if we failed to think about what a future without COVID would look like. What changes can we make now to ensure businesses build forward and prepare better? How can we incorporate greater respect for both people and planet into business plans for the post-COVID era? The Pacific region faces both common and unique challenges, and individually, Pacific states are at different levels of progress when it comes to implementing the guiding principles. I would strongly encourage Pacific states to develop a national action plan on business and human rights in an inclusive and consultative manner in line with the working group's recommendation. The guiding principles provide a pathway for states and businesses to achieve a more just, inclusive, and sustainable economy. The OHCHR's guidance note on business and human rights in times of COVID-19 and the working group's information note on a roadmap for recovery in times of economic crisis provide further guidance on building greater resilience and in preparing better. In this vein, when looking at the linkages between human rights, the SDGs, and the climate agenda, for instance, it is important to note that the Human Rights Council has taken steps to help to address these linkages. At its 48th session, the Council adopted a resolution establishing a special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, to study the impact of climate change on human rights and to make recommendations regarding how to address and prevent climate change adverse human rights impacts. Moreover, also at the 48th session, the Council adopted a resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right, which is important for the enjoyment of all human rights. The Pacific states were fundamental to both these resolutions being presented and adopted by the Human Rights Council. These resolutions, which are particularly important for small island developing states, including in the Pacific, advance the discussions on the impact of climate change environmental degradation, and the loss of biodiversity on human rights. It is my great hope that these resolutions and the activities that they trigger will create synergies in efforts to promote human rights in the context of climate change and to fully realize the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment within the business and human rights agenda. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, before concluding, I would like to highlight one particular important good practice we need to preserve so that the business and human rights agenda is effectively advanced in the Pacific. We must ensure that civic state is open and that all stakeholders and communities, particularly individuals and groups in vulnerable and marginalized situations, are meaningfully consulted and engaged when working to advance the business and human rights agenda. As we all know, the best and most responsive human rights policies are created when the populations most vulnerable to human rights violations are involved in their development. In this connection, let us endeavor to keep our civil space open and by so doing, creating particularly effective human rights policies in the context of business. Vinaka Vakalevu, I thank you.
So I would like to thank Madam President to find time to record this message. This is very much appreciated. And I think her last point about the importance of preserving civic space and the inclusive and consultative processes, whether it is about national action plan or businesses doing human rights due diligence, is absolutely vital. And I think that provides a good linkage to bring the next speaker. So I would like to now invite Lucille, if she is there. And Lucille, are you there? If you can be... Okay, if you are there, my question to you is basically that what role do you see for the governments and companies going forward in terms of what they should do differently to respect the rights of individuals and communities on the ground? Do we have, see? Seems we don't have her for now. Okay, so in that case, I will move on to another panelist. I see Sagufta, you are here. Thank you very much for joining. And another important stakeholder, in my view, the youth. So what role youth can play in pushing responsible business conduct? So Sagufta, if you can highlight your ambitions and based on your experiences, because you have been part of both youth leadership in the region, and you also established a social enterprise. So if I could combine these two aspects, how do you see the role of the youth and also this idea of developing a social enterprise in promoting responsible business conduct in the region? You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you everyone. And Bula Vinaka, thank you for this opportunity to share my experiences in this platform. So from my perspective, young people now more than ever are changing the way businesses are being conducted, and more people, more and more young people now we are seeing transitioning from seeking employment to becoming job creators. So through the means of entrepreneurship. And most of these young businesses, especially in the Pacific region, are setting up social enterprises, businesses that have social impacts, or businesses that are, focused on people and planet rather than just on profits. So incorporation of human rights laws and sustainable development goals is essential to set up a social enterprise. And specifically now, I think with all of the incentives that have been announced in our recent budget, and then, the incentives that have been announced during the COP negotiations, we are now seeing a rise of new business ideas that are creating green jobs, that are creating blue jobs in the economy, and that they are working towards these jobs. So there needs to be a lot of capacity building that we need in this specific area, because we do have entrepreneurship based courses here in Fiji. I mean, we're now starting to see that culture where there's accelerator programs coming up, there's a lot of capacity building programs coming up, but I have been through a few of those, but we see a miss between business and human rights. So it will have, the basic studies around finances, marketing, and everything, but human rights is always a miss. And that is something I feel that we strongly need to focus on. And for my social enterprise personally, I think someone just, a speaker earlier raised an issue about, working with communities. That is basically what we do. So at Fusion Hub, we go into communities, we conduct trainings, and then we provide them with the right resources and tools so they can make products and, or they can deliver certain services. And we ensure that they get access to fair prices, that they are paid fairly for their skills, for the job that they do, and they're given market access as well. So I believe that the conversations that we are having also need to trickle down to communities who are not really aware of the specific rights, especially the young people in the communities who are often marginalized and often exploited by, say, international vendors or resellers, in terms of entrepreneurship, when we speak about entrepreneurship. So they would buy a certain craft for, say, $5 and sell it at hundreds or thousands of dollars in their own countries. So this is where the mismatch is, and this is something that we need to protect. We need to protect our artists. We need to protect our local knowledge and culture and heritage as well when we talk about trading these things. So we really need to hone down on the aspects of what are we doing to protect these communities, what are we doing to sort of create capacity so that they are aware of what their rights are, what their basic rights are, especially when they are operating their own little businesses, when they are forming cooperatives. Are these human rights concerns are mentioned in the bylaws, and what are the standards that we are setting? So I am also the executive director for Fiji's BPO Council, Business Process Outsourcing Council. And this is an area that a lot of investors are, looking at Fiji for in present times because of the tax incentives that have been announced by the government. And in other countries, like in our competing countries like Philippines and even in India, you see a lot of sweatshops being run by these high-end investors, and there's a lot of violations that happen. So with these up and coming industries, with these new industries that are coming up, even new startups in this space, we need to ensure that some certain level of standards are being developed and that they are followed, and and those that are in violation of these standards are held accountable for their actions. So with trying to protect the entrepreneurship space, especially looking at the young people, there needs to be a lot of capacity building that needs to happen so that there's a larger impact. Usually these conversations stop at a certain level. It's not sort of disseminated into the communities, and it's always central to one location. So it really needs to now trickle down into communities so people are more aware of what needs to be done in these spaces. So that is a bit from me.
Oh, that's good. That is what, excuse me, that is very much appreciated. Now, if the technicians could pin all the panelists together so that we can have a little bit of a dialogue in the last 10 minutes. And I understand Heike is also online. So Heike, if you are free, would you mind joining us as well? Because I just want to spontaneously do something in the last 10 minutes to develop a plan, basically. Because Jonathan talked about the leadership. Paul is saying Australia is willing to lead. UNDP is saying we want to start work in the Pacific. Last year, the Attorney General of Fiji spoke at the first forum as well. And he said, oh, we want to do this work as well. So what I want to do is that the working group in discussion with the Office of the High Commissioner, we started this idea of 2+3 strategy. The two countries are New Zealand and Australia. And the three countries we wanted to pick to start with are Fiji, PNG, and Samoa. And of course, others are not excluded, but we want to start somewhere, right? So the idea is that we work together and push this agenda together in the Pacific, because our destiny is connected. You have migrant workers going, you have the extractive sector companies coming out of Australia and New Zealand operating in this part of the world, right? Tourism is interconnected, right? Climate change is a major issue. So how do we go forward? And I think what is crucial is that we look at the inward impact as well as outward impact. And I think all the panelists acknowledged it, right? So in the last 10 minutes or so, I want to go back to each one of you and have a couple of thoughts, just 2 minutes maximum. Does this make sense that we work together and develop this strategy? Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, PNG, right? And we have in the opening session, the Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, he also spoke about the ocean strategy, right? So how do we take it to the next stage? That is what I'm trying to manufacture here artificially or probably spontaneously. So probably I would like to start with Jonathan, if you don't mind, Jonathan. Any final thoughts? Where do you see this plan for the Pacific going beyond New Zealand? Thank you.
Thanks, Surya. Always dangerous to ask an outgoing High Commissioner what he thinks about something, because it's very easy for me to say I agree with everything you say. And
I think I'm in a similar boat, Jonathan, because I will finish my term in the working group in April next year. So I'm also the outgoing member of this region, you know. So let us manufacture something together. Well,
look, I quite like actually the idea of working closely with Fiji. I can't speak to the examples of PNG and Samoa, but I think there's all the right ingredients between New Zealand and Fiji to start having a regular dialogue on business and human rights, and to look at how all the really important aspects of the relationship, which we already speak in terms of human rights, in terms of our business and trade relationship, in terms of cooperation on law enforcement, for example. In fact, one of New Zealand's, I think, most recent examples of law enforcement action against migrant worker exploitation was a case in New Zealand connected with Fiji, and that was a great example of cooperation between the New Zealand and Fijian authorities to successfully manage that case through to prosecution. So I think the relationship between New Zealand and Fiji is mature and very ripe to have this kind of mainstreamed into the dialogue that we have regularly with the government of Fiji, and to talk about ways in which we can cooperate and very tangibly around, national action plans, around sharing, legislation that New Zealand is working on at the moment. And I noticed, if I can just address it very quickly in the chat box, a comment around, what's New Zealand doing about migrant worker exploitation, given some recent, media examples. And I think we're taking this very seriously. The government reviewed worker exploitation in the context of our seasonal labour scheme. Government's absolutely committed to ending modern slavery and worker exploitation. And we're trying to help migrant workers to better understand their rights and responsibilities when working in New Zealand, making it easier for migrant workers to report and leave exploitative employment, and reducing the risk of exploitation occurring, and that includes through deterrence as well. So, these are really important issues for us. They're issues that relate absolutely to Fiji and the workers and the business relationships that we have moving between the two countries. So I think it's a great idea. We should start the conversation.
Thank you. So before I go to Heike, Paul, I would like to come back to you. And I don't know if you want to add something as a reflection to what I'm proposing, that we develop this strategy for the region, So even if technically Australia, New Zealand may be part of the VOG system in the UN family, physical proximity to this part of the world is there, right? So if we work together, we could definitely push the agenda on business and human rights. So any reflections from your side?
Absolutely. I mean, apart from not wanting to repeat what Jonathan has said, but Jonathan's made a number of very strong observations, particularly in regard to Fiji, a number of strong and sensible observations, and his comments also about taken from the chat about worker exploitation are of course issues that Australia takes very, very seriously as well. So the only thing I wanted to add, and just going back to what I was saying earlier, was really going back to the point I was making about how Jonathan has made, and I think your question, Surya, is based around the role of government here. But I would say that any actions or any set of actions obviously also need to have business and business bodies at the centre of it, and building those peer relationships, which exist already because businesses do business with each other. So it's more than simply governments talking. It's more than governments also talking in the context of bilaterally or within multilateral or regional organisations. It's where are the businesses and where do they join in the conversation?
Yeah. No, I think I totally agree. This is more than the government's talking, but I think the governments cannot also play football. They just pass it on to the companies, and companies say, oh, we wait for the laws to come from the government, right? So everyone has to play its own part. And I think that's why we have Vanessa, who also is part of the Global Compact Network Australia, and we had the business representative in the opening session. So we are definitely having businesses as part of this conversation, but we also don't want anyone playing around this game of passing the buck, to be honest. That's why I'm bringing everyone together, UN agencies, governments, civil society actors, companies, industry associations. So Heike, I think that's a good opportunity. It seems there is some appetite for the leadership on the part of the governments here. So where do you see, because you are the key person based in SUA, where do you see, can you play this role of connecting the dots and take it forward from here before I invite Livio? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Surya, and many thanks to the panelists. That was really quite interesting and very inspiring what you've all been saying. Can we do this? Well, I mean, we have been supporting this space, this agenda for the past 3 years through our work on business and human rights, but we can't do it alone. And in some ways, I would say the more the merrier. And of course, we have really valued the cooperation and collaboration with the working group under your guidance, under Anita's leadership previously. So that's really important. What I would say is that, we'd really like to keep that channel of communication open with critical civil society activists, with human rights defenders. Just today, we had a parallel discussion as we were launching a report on the situation of human rights defenders, especially women human rights defenders in 7 Pacific Islands states. And we had a lot of parallel discussions there about, the challenges, but also many of the opportunities for better protection of environmental human rights defenders. So we'd like to keep that. It's key to have that dialogue. I was very impressed by some of what was said in the opening session that I was able to moderate about businesses already stepping up to the plate and already taking their responsibilities very seriously. I think that needs to be recognized. It's not like we are just coming up with, suggestions and businesses are not doing anything, and governments are also taking it very seriously. But yes, it needs to be followed by action. So if we can remain open for collaboration with other partners, we will certainly do that, and hopefully pursue that 3+2 or maybe 10+2 strategy at some point. Hopefully it'll expand. It's all a question of the vision, right? Thank you very much, Surya, and everyone.
Thank you very much, Heike. So I think the collaborative partnership and keeping the conversation going, as Paul was saying, and bringing all the stakeholders together on this table of conversation is absolutely vital, right? So Livio, any thoughts from your side? Because you also mentioned the UNDP may start thinking about a couple of countries in the Pacific, and Heike is saying, oh, they cannot do it alone. So the working group is, of course, part of the partnership, but we very much look forward to having closer collaboration with UNDP in the region on the BHR agenda. So any thoughts from your side?
Sure, thank you. Certainly, count us in whenever there is a plan and there is a possibility for UNDP to come in. We will be happy to in the field of business and human rights. My reflection is, Surya, you know how much I like plans, right? How much time we spend on national action plans. Now, when we advise governments on that, we always say, if you had to plan, you also need to identify responsible parties for each of the action and possibly indicators of success and costing of each of action and so on and so on. Now, there's no time to go through the whole log frame, if you like, but let me attempt to also assign some responsible party, as we call them, roles to the different stepping stones, as I've been calling them. So if we start from awareness, right, that we all agree is perhaps first step. I look at probably CSOs, national human rights institutions, those on the ground to be focusing a lot more on awareness and advocacy. I know this is happening, but probably there's a need for more of that. Obviously, with the help of the United Nations, of development partners, because CSOs and HRIs will need resources to do that. Will and commitment, that's what we expect from governments and companies, indeed, right? We need unequivocal commitments, more and more to come. I'm glad Heike said there are some good champions already. We need more champions from government to do more NAPs, which we have heard from everyone are needed, and from companies to do not just human rights policies, but to actually do human rights due diligence. And if I may, one reality check of real commitment will be resources, allocating some resources to it, both from states and from companies. And then, of course, there must be an action also for the development sectors, right? For actors like us. And then on that, I go into building capacity, right? I mean, this was mentioned again over and over here. There is a need for us to step in. Certainly when it comes to UNDP, we will be able to offer two key things. One is our comparative experience, because we've been working on this in Asia already. And second is our field presence, right? Which is in all the countries in focus. Obviously, I'm not here able to commit necessarily our field work in this very moment, but I can guarantee you that I'll work very hard with our country offices to become more and more active actors and play a role in this 2+3 action plan that you are referring to. Obviously, there will be a need to connect all these dots between all these actions. So let me say that a forum like this, which has been found very productive, will also be important on the way forward to be that to give that possibility to connect all the dots between all these actions that will be taken. There's no silver bullet, as I think Vanessa said. Rome was not built in a day, if we want to say another word that applies to these things. But I do think having a roadmap, like we have done, Surya, in other parts of the world, is the way forward. And I look forward to unpacking this initial discussion into perhaps a little bit more detailed roadmap and allocate some commitments from our side soon on its implementation. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Livio. That's very promising. At least you are moving in this particular direction of making this commitment. This is very much appreciated. Now we have, in fact, run out of time. I don't know if there's any 30-second remark from Sagufta. You want to say anything, because you also represent a business, social enterprise. Any thoughts you have as a youth leader or anything that you want to reflect where we should be going quickly?
Sure. I think this one main point that I would like to make, which I have already made, is to include the young people in these conversations. It's not just the governments and the CSOs, but we are almost 60% of the population of the Pacific. So I think it's very crucial that young people and their voices are heard when these discussions happen and when these collaborations happen. So yeah, that's my 30-second spill.
Absolutely great point. And I can assure you that we are already acting on this in a very concrete term. The Asia Pacific session at the UN Forum next week is going to focus on the youth voices. And we have a youth speaker on climate change who will be part of that conversation. So we would like to keep youth front and center to this discussion about business and human rights, because they are the future leaders, they are the future investors, they are the consumers, they're everyone. I mean, so they will be the key to bring this positive change. So unless there is anything from any panelist that you want to say, I would like to take this opportunity. Oh, I see now the Lucille. I don't know. Sorry that because of the internet issue, we could not have you earlier. Any 30 seconds from your side? I feel sorry that we could not give you the floor. We wanted really the community perspective from PNG. Anything you want to highlight very quickly before I wind it up? I'm not sure if her internet is good enough. And I think that reflects also the challenge, you know. And I think that's where the challenges that are unique in terms of the accessibility are quite critical, and all this we need to factor in when we move the agenda in this particular part of the world. So with this, colleagues, let me thank all of you for finding time out of your busy schedule to join this conversation. This is very much appreciated. I would also like to thank once again the entire team that worked for many, many months to pull this forum together. This is not easy, I can assure you, to connect the dots. Very much appreciated. I also appreciate the leadership shown by Heike and her team in pulling it together, working with the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Last but not least, I would also like to thank the interpreters who are doing a wonderful job of making it really inclusive in terms of engaging all of us in society. So Bula Vinaka, thank you everyone. And I hope that this forum will be back next year. I will not be there as a part of the working group next year, but I will definitely continue to work in my personal academic capacity. And I look forward to working with you going forward. Thank you and bye for now.